everyone, and welcome to what is the March forecast for the new moon in Pisces that's happening on the 2nd of March 2022. So that's a lot of twos. The numerologists would say that this is breaks down to the number 8, and of course for me the number 8 is all about transformation. Some people say it's the number of the self, but I tend to think of it in terms of like the 8th house in astrology, which is all about sex, death, transformation, so kind of Scorpio themes, so death and rebirth. And we are kind of currently moving through quite strange times. Geopolitically things have been quite unstable, and it's interesting when we look at the human design that we'll see that this is reflected in where the planets are in the gates. But we also are at a kind of a pivot point represented by the Venus-Mars-Pluto conjunction, which happens I think on the 3rd of March. We're going to look at that as well in terms of the human design and the astrology, because I think this plays into the quite dark energy that we are seeing, particularly played out in Europe with the whole Russia-Ukraine situation, and how this is kind of casting a shadow onto financial markets. And I think it began really at that Jupiter Uranus sextile a week or so ago, and even though that's ostensibly a very positive transit, I think that the problem was that it's negatively aspecting planets in Putin's chart, and that has kind of confused things a little bit, so that's why we're getting a bit of static. So anyway, we will look at that in more detail as well, because obviously it does affect overall sentiment quite substantially. And then we'll just have a look at the Bitcoin chart and the ETH chart just to see what's kind of going on. So let's dive in and see what we can see. So I thought I would just start off with this, in case you didn't see my new moon forecast, the sort of the more astrology based one, that we are in the middle of what we call Pisces season, which is essentially when the sun is transiting through the zodiac sign of Pisces, and that is in the Western zodiac system. So we're not talking about the constellation of Pisces, we're talking about the division of what we call the ecliptic, which is the apparent path of the sun from the perspective of Earth as it circles around the Earth during the course of a solar year. So Pisces season traditionally is considered to be the last month of the solar year. It's very similar to December in our our calendar year. And so really what we're doing is we are kind of going through that dark night of the soul, or that sort of old year's eve type of energy, where we're closing something out and we are waiting for the beginning of the new solar year, which happens at the equinox in kind of mid-March, so 21st of March or so. So this is the last new moon of the kind of the old year, if you like. And so I think we need to understand where we are psychologically in that respect, and I think it is reflected sort of by how people often feel during Pisces season, which is quite drained, sometimes feeling a little bit overwhelmed. Depression can sort of set in, and we can start to feel a bit directionless and sometimes despairing, depending on what transits are kind of happening, what cosmological weather is doing. And for me, this is represented quite strongly by the tarot card, the Ten of Wands, which is the last card in the sort of minor arcana suite of the wands. And it really relates to a feeling of overwhelm or pressure or stress that can seem never ending. It is like that sort of dark night of the soul, but very often it's the darkness before the dawn. And as I said in my last forecast, I was really struck by Ukrainian President Zelensky when he said to his people during the night that Kiev was bombed, the first night that it was bombed, that this night will be difficult, very difficult, but morning will come. And I think this is how we need to sort of view this period. And I think we're getting to the point now where we are starting to see glimmers of hope, and I think it is being reflected in the markets, and it's because people are starting to see the upside of Bitcoin. And this in turn is reflected in the astrology of the new moon. I mean, we do have Jupiter, first of all, making a conjunction to the sun and the moon at the new moon, so this is adding some really positive energy to the overall feeling of this 2-week period. And then on top of that, it's also making some very positive aspects to the Bitcoin sun. So there is kind of hope on the horizon, and I think the key thing here is to kind of practice surrender, flow, and release. So that Japanese concept of wu-wei, I think, is very apt right now. And that's all about kind of effortless action. And it's interesting because it actually developed in relation to the spring and autumn periods, which is where we are now, when we get to the equinox, when everything is generally in flux, but it's also coming into balance. The sun is coming up to the sort of declination of the equator, and so we're moving towards the equal day and night, which will happen at the equinox. And so we're really trying to move effortlessly in the flow of things in order to kind of come into balance. And it makes me think so much of hexagram 16 in the I Ching, which is called riding the elephant, and that's all about kind of free-flowing spontaneity and an unconflicted personal harmony. And I think we'll see this when we look at the human design. So if we move to the gates that we're kind of working with during this 2-week period, the luminaries are first of all in hexagram 63 line 1. So you can see the sun here and then the moon down here. They're both in hexagram 63 line 1, and that's because at new moons we always have the sun and the moon making a conjunction. So this is in the crown chakra, the crown center, in both the ordinary sort of Vedic system of the the chakras, and also in the human design body graph. And this obviously has to do with kind of incoming thoughts or inspiration from from outside of us. So this can be divine inspiration, it can be getting good ideas, that kind of thing. And it's interesting that hexagram 63 is traditionally called already crossing, so it's about being in transition. And I really do feel as though Pisces season is very much a kind of a liminal period, as is as I say, as is the spring and autumn seasons. These are the shoulder seasons where we are switching from kind of winter to summer and vice versa, and or from autumn to winter. And I think we need to view this period in the same way, that it is a very liminal period, and as such there's a lot of uncertainty. We aren't really sure where we're kind of heading next, as old things dissolve, but we haven't yet got to the point where we know exactly where we're kind of heading. So it's about dealing with doubt in the face of uncertainty, and I think that is really how a lot of people are feeling, and that can be reflected in the market. I think there's a lot of uncertainty out there. So the key lesson associated with this particular gate is learning to discipline the critical mind so that it doesn't paralyze us, so that we aren't prevented from either getting inspirational ideas that will take us in a new direction, or become so paralyzed by negativity and fear that we fail to move when that we fail to move when the time comes, when the appointed time comes. And again, I talked about this in my new moon forecast, that the critical mind in a way is like the kind of the inner critic, and this can be really, really paralyzing. It can lead us to a lot of depression, because it's very much associated with I'm not enough, with kind of poverty mentality, and that takes us out of those high frequency, more kind of open, receptive energies that allow us to receive inspiration, and to find new ways through difficult times. And so it's very important to put criticism into perspective, whether it comes from outside or whether it comes from ourselves, not to sort of take things too personally, and in a way that involves a certain detachment. And I think that's why this channel is very much associated with kind of scientific thinking. In other words, empiricism, in the sense of like trying to be detached, or I hate the word objective because I don't think objectivity is entirely possible, but trying to sort of detach any preconceived notions of outcomes, or getting too personally attached to a particular outcome. So trying to see things from a kind of a neutral perspective, having a kind of a curious mind, and not taking things too personally. So in Richard Rudd's system, it's the movement from self-doubt or suspicion to truth, and that happens through inquiry. So again, employing the scientific method, like testing different things out to see what's kind of working, before we jump to sort of conclusions or make assumptions. So I think that's going to be really important over the next 2 weeks. And then also very important during this time is the Venus-Mars-Pluto conjunction, which happens within a day or so of this new moon. This is quite a full-on conjunction, mainly because Mars and Pluto in and of themselves can be about war and death and destruction, that kind of thing. Fortunately, we do have this sort of the mediating aspect of Venus here, which is all about kind of peace and diplomacy. But whether she's enough to actually mitigate the Mars-Pluto combination remains to be seen, particularly when it comes to the potential for war, and particularly nuclear war in Europe. So I think it's interesting that they are having their conjunction or they will make their conjunction in hexagram 60 line 2, which is interestingly at the bottom. So we've got the top and the bottom centers activated, and of course the root center is all about survival. And of course, you know, what this is our kind of primal fears and instincts being activated by the sort of looming specter of war. And so it's interesting that this particular gate is all about coming to terms with limitations and restrictions. So having to work with limitation, or with what is, rather than how we would like things to be. And the key thing here is acceptance, which allows for the possibility of flow and transcendence, so that kind of wu wei, that accepting energy. And just by accepting one's limitations, or accepting the circumstances rather than resisting or saying, well, think this shouldn't be like this, rather just by accepting things as they are, we create space to find new ways to resolve old problems. And I think this could be the key to how we move through this period of uncertainty without getting too doubtful or fearful, and therefore becoming sort of paralyzed or operating from a position of lack or fear. So the advice is to adapt to restraints and to have good boundaries. And of course, you know, I think that's always key during Pisces season, is to have good boundaries. Otherwise you can feel overwhelmed. You can feel like compassion overload, where you get sort of compassion fatigue, where you feel like if you watch the news it makes you depressed. You kind of get into that point of despair where you don't feel as though there's any point in carrying on. So we have to really have good boundaries, and that can be good routines, or just limiting our diet of sort of negativity, only allowing ourselves to entertain it for so long, and then also just sort of switching off and or having sort of matter of fact like logical ways to counter that type of thinking, because very often it's not based in logic. You know, if you think about what is fear the acronym for, I can never remember. Fear. Oh, what is it? It's. Oh, I can't remember now. But anyway, I think most of us kind of know that it's something about, you know, something that's not real appearing real. And this is how the mind tricks us into staying in states of like fear and depression, and not making any changes. So I think what's so interesting is that the advice is to, even though we must adapt to restraints and have good boundaries, we must also be ready to act if the opportunity arises, because this is happening in line 2, which is all about opportunity. It's about moving with opportunities if they present themselves. So it's about this combination of fluidity on one hand, which is very Piscean, and readiness on the other. And, you know, being in a liminal state between Pisces and Aries is all about action, and that's what the sun moves into at the equinox. I think it's interesting. It's that liminality of being between these two things. Yes. So I think being, you know, I was drawn to an image of Picasso's painting, in which there's an acrobat. It's an alchemical painting, and I think, you know, the acrobat really represents that liminality, in that they train and they're very limber, their muscles are very limber, and they are able to kind of bend easily into maybe positions that seem kind of unnatural, but at the same time there's also this sort of readiness or ability to sort of move very quickly if necessary, to kind of spring, to jump, to fly, you know, into the air, and like on a trapeze or whatever it is. And so I think that's the energy that we need to sort of embody right now. So let's move on to the Bitcoin chart itself. So a couple of interesting things happening. We can see that on the kind of negative side, we've got Uranus making a T-square to the Bitcoin ascendant-descendant axis, so in other words with the horizon. And so this, I think, points to the sort of generalized fear and anxiety that we've seen in the markets, that, you know, the quite a lot of like skittish volatility that's been around, you know, since the beginning of the year, or since December really, since we had that Saturn Uranus square. And then we've also got another square happening between, so it's Chiron, it's transiting Chiron, that's making this square down to the Bitcoin sun, which is interesting. So, I mean, Chiron is an interesting one. Chiron is often where people feel that they don't fit in, or they are alienated, or somehow outcasts. And I think what's so interesting about people who tend to gravitate towards Bitcoin in particular is that they usually do feel like that anyway, like misfits or outcasts. And so I kind of think that Bitcoin is coming into its own as a result of this crisis. A lot of people sent donations to Ukraine via the Bitcoin network, and a lot of people in Ukraine have been able to get out, despite the fact that the banking systems have gone down, by using sort of cryptocurrencies as a way to sort of to transact and to continue to be able to buy things. So I think that Chiron could be pointing to that, because even though the Bitcoin sun has a negative transit here to Chiron, it does have a very positive sextile. It's making a positive sextile to this this new moon that we are about to have in Pisces, which is happening in the 8th house. So it's against the house of shared resources. So again, interesting that we've got this idea of people making donations, to a kind of a Bitcoin fund to help people in Ukraine, and at the same time, there's also been various measures by various institutions, either to try and help people, like with Visa, to try and keep people's cards working, so that people in Ukraine can still eat, or buy tickets out of town, that kind of thing. So I think this kind of is almost a good countermeasure for the square, and on top of that, we also have a really nice. We've got Jupiter in the bargain too. So Jupiter is actually closer. It's just come off of a sextile to that the Bitcoin sun, and I think that's why we are seeing a rally currently. Bitcoin's gone up, I think, about, I don't know, between 17 and 20% in the last couple of days. So again, I think interesting that Jupiter is showing, I think, a glimmer of hope in all of this. That actually it's showing, it's proving the case for Bitcoin. It's showing why it's so important, why cryptocurrencies are so important, that they really can provide a source of hope and a source of like a way out, a life raft during difficult times, when governments might be trying to shut you down or control you, or when systems go down, infrastructure fails. So that's really interesting. And then we've also got this the conjunction happening between Venus, Mars and Pluto, and we can see that it's happening very close to the Bitcoin Jupiter, and that could be problematic. As I say, it depends very much on what happens with Putin, because it certainly to me indicates potential for kind of war. It's quite a nasty, particularly in the Mars Pluto conjunction. But then we also have to think that Bitcoin has a Mars Pluto conjunction natally. You can see it here, Pluto at 1 degree and Mars at 5 degrees of Capricorn. So in a way, Bitcoin is very resilient and it's quite tough, and so it may be that that these energies now, that Bitcoin kind of comes into its own in terms of being the sort of the ultimate survivor, and helping people who are in sort of desperate situations to survive too. So it could work in one of two ways, and we do need to bear in mind, as I say, that Venus is also kind of in on the bargain, and that she does rule the 11th house of the chart, and she also rules the 4th house, the 4th house cusp. So really, it could be that this is where Bitcoin really proves itself in terms of helping its community by staying kind of rooted and stable during unstable times, and also kind of bringing out the more altruistic side of people as a result of the crisis. Bitcoin is making donations to help their fellow men and women and so on in Ukraine. So yes, I think a lot depends on what happens with Putin, because we do have to bear in mind that in his chart, I did actually mention this on one of my Twitter posts, that in his chart at the moment, this transiting Uranus is in his descendant. It's on his descendant, and it's approaching his Jupiter. So it could sort of lead to more and more exaggerated threats, like he's been making about putting his nuclear deterrent on high alert, that kind of thing. So it could make him a little bit impulsive or overconfident, and making mistakes as a result of it. And also, it's also making an opposition to his Venus in Scorpio, which sits in his 1st house, because we think he's got Scorpio rising. We're not 100% sure. But if it does, it certainly can heighten his paranoia, and it can make him very unpredictable and volatile. So I think we have to bear that in mind. If you think about the sort of the nuclear process. It involves plutonium and uranium. So we do have to consider both Pluto and Uranus in this situation, in the kind of geopolitical situation, and that T-square, you know, to the ascendant-descendant axis can't be ignored, particularly given that Uranus is actually also figuring into the new moon via a sextile to the luminary. So even again, it's positive, but I think the problem being the same as the problem that we had when we had the Jupiter-Uranus sextile, is that even though it's a positive aspect, it's not making a positive aspect to Putin's chart. And because he's such a big player on the world stage, you know, he's a manifester. This is someone who's got very, very, very powerful energy, sort of from a human design perspective, that this can upset the apple cart, it can upset the natural order of things, you know, much as Hitler did sort of during the Second World War. And, you know, he, as I pointed out, he has the same type of chart. He was also a kind of, I think it's a 5-1 splenic manifester, so quite an unusual type, but equally powerful and equally unstable. So we do just have to bear that in mind, that nothing is set in stone at this point. Yes, so, but I mean, this transiting Chiron is also making a trine to the Bitcoin ascendant. We mustn't forget that. So even though it might be making a square to the sun, it's also making a trine to the ascendant, and these are very similar signifiers, the ascendant and the sun for Bitcoin, because the sun rules the ascendant. So this could mitigate that, and it could lead to a potential repair, and we've seen that already. As I say, Bitcoin is sort of up quite substantially from its lows a couple of weeks ago. So that could be, it could be that as a result, as a reaction to what's happening in Europe, people start pulling together and they start realizing the use case for Bitcoin, and this leads to a surge in the price. So yes, and then the last thing to bear in mind is that Mercury and Saturn are applying to the Bitcoin Neptune. So you know, the Bitcoin Neptune sits here in the descendant, in the 7th house, very close to the to Venus, and you can see Mercury here with Saturn, and I mean that aspect can work both ways. A conjunction is neutral, so it can be either positive or negative. It's simply a combining of these two energies of Mercury and Saturn. So it can lead to a stabilized way of thinking, and being quite sensible and making good logical decisions, like we saw with, you know, where the gate where the luminaries sit. So this hexagram 63, you know, it's sitting here in, as I say, in this channel to do with scientific thinking. So Mercury and Saturn could definitely encourage that type of thinking, which is good because it frees you from doubt and suspicion. But on the other hand, it can sometimes lead to sort of doom and gloom thinking. So it could combine with, you know, any of the sort of skittish energy of this T-square to Uranus. So we do just have to bear that in mind. But I'm hoping that it's going to bring clarity and steady nerves, because, as I say, it is applying to Neptune, and Neptune can be quite nebulous and lack boundaries or clear thinking. It can be overly emotional and sort of like all over the place. So it could help to create the necessary boundaries to be able to think clearly in a crisis and to make good decisions. So, you know, that could kind of go either way. Yes, so I think a mixed bag at the moment for Bitcoin, but you know, I'm leaning towards, there's definitely the potential here for a silver lining, given that we've got Jupiter in the mix, you know, at this new moon, and as we know, Jupiter is the great benefic, and that, you know, these are in turn making positive aspects to Saturn, to Uranus, which should hopefully offset the jangling nerves, and that its application to the Bitcoin Sun should hopefully bode well too. So I think it just remains to be seen, like in the next day or two, what happens with that Venus-Mars-Pluto conjunction, because I think that will be the sort of deciding factor moving forward as to whether we move into, whether we make a major transition through dark energy into light. So we kind of go through a kind of a catharsis and then into a healing, or whether we sort of tumble into the underworld. I think, you know, a lot will depend on what happens in Europe. And then, you know, briefly, I thought we'd look at Ethereum. I think, you know, generally speaking, what happens with Bitcoin tends to happen with the other altcoins, but it's always interesting to just have a look at some of the other cryptos in the space. And it's interesting in this chart that we've got the new moon approaching the Ethereum IC-MC axis. So the fundamentals essentially here being emphasized by the chart, So there could be some important developments, some kind of seismic shift that sort of leads to Ethereum possibly heading in a new direction. So that could be interesting. We do have to bear in mind that Neptune has been undermining this particular chart point. It, as I said, it tends to dissolve things, and you don't really want to dissolve your roots, because then you kind of destabilize situations, and that could be the sort of the gas fees that have been quite high, and have really, I think, stopped people from using Ethereum as any form of currency, really. But given that Jupiter is applying to the IC, there could be an event that happens which changes this. And Jupiter does rule the ascendant of the chart. It is actually at 0 degrees of Sagittarius. So and it's with Venus natally. So it could be that the geopolitical developments also end up benefiting Ethereum in some fundamental way. So that's really positive. And we can see here that Jupiter's making it's Neptune making a trine to the Ethereum Mars in the sort of in the 8th house, which again bodes well. I mean, I'm still wondering whether we're going to get some kind of Ethereum ETF at some point. We've had quite a few Bitcoin ones now, including that Valkyrie one which got the OK recently, but it'll be interesting to see whether we get an Ethereum ETF. I do think that that could happen, but equally there's a lot happening in the sort of the NFT space. There's a lot happening in terms of like the so-called metaverse, where people are setting up things like Paris Hilton is doing a virtual fashion show, and somebody else is, I think, holding like a virtual sports event, something like that, all of which can have positive knock-on effects for particularly Ethereum. It is very closely associated with the so-called metaverse. So there looks like there are potentially positive developments, kind of coming there, which will continue to fuel the speculation that we're seeing in the NFT space, of people making millions from auctions on sort of NFTs in sort of just in a few minutes. And then there's also a very positive trine happening here between the Ethereum moon in the 2nd house and Venus, Mars, and Pluto, and they are kind of activating a sextile to the ascendant, as well as I say, this trine to the Ethereum North Node. So again, what happens, when we get to this conjunction could be really pivotal for Ethereum too, but it looks like in a very positive way. Something that's kind of destined, that will affect its destiny or its future in quite a profound way, and that has something to do with crowds or with women, but can also affect the price. And I mean, Ethereum is very much marketed along feminine lines, with its kind of pastel colors and that kind of thing. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, actually. It is in the 2nd house, so it is about assets, it is about value as well. So again, it could point to NFTs and digital assets, and the smart contracts associated with them, but we'll have to kind of see what sort of plays out. But generally speaking, it's interesting how much more positive this new moon looks for Ethereum as opposed to Bitcoin. But I mean, we can look at the chart, but ultimately I think the key thing is that ultimately, if things don't go well in the market, that is going to have a negative effect on the crypto space, because they are the two. There is a correlation between the sort of the equities market and the crypto market still, and also if things don't go well for Bitcoin, generally they don't go well for any other currency either. So uncertain times, as we saw from the human design, and I think we just have to kind of take things one day at a time and move with the times, be fluid, and if rallies do happen, be kind of ready to act if we want to be trading and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's kind of it for me, short and sweet. Yes, interesting times. It's going to be an interesting week, I think. So I think fingers crossed that that things start to improve, particularly, as I say, once we get past this major hurdle, this pivot point of the Venus-Mars-Pluto conjunction. But thinking of you all, my heart goes out to the people of Ukraine, and yes, happy trading, take care out there, and I'll see you again for my full moon forecast in a couple of weeks.